welcome everyone to another session. This session I'm really excited about. I have Chelsie Messenger with me today, and she's going to be talking inclusive by design. To give a little background on Chelsie, though, she's a consultant at Slalom's customer experience practice, specializing in service design and inclusive product strategy, a very important thing. Her background is in research, writing, and rhetoric, has given her a unique human-centric approach to innovation and problem solving, which is, as we know, really important. Most importantly, Chelsie believes that we all have a responsibility to build a more diverse and equitable digital future. And I'd say all futures, not even digital, but certainly digital indeed. So thank you, Chelsie, for being here and participating in Product Camp, and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and for everyone for joining today's session. I've included my contact information here in the presentation. So if you do have any additional questions or you want to get in touch following this session, I would love for you to reach out. Just a couple of facts about me before we get started. I am located in Northeast Minneapolis, and three of my favorite things are Premier League soccer, canoeing, and Korean dramas. What I want to get started with today is just to tell you a little bit of a story about the Microsoft Adaptive Controller. So you may have seen this in a series of commercials that were run by Microsoft a few years ago. There's some similarities with a traditional Xbox controller, but most of the buttons have been replaced by the two touchpads that take up the majority of the device. And there's an entire row of ports along the top side. One of the people that was really central to how the adaptive controller came to be is Mark Bartlett, an Air Force veteran who suffers from a lot of pain due to a spinal cord injury. He's the founder of Able Gamers, which is an organization that advocates for the more than 30 million differently abled gamers in the US. Despite this huge number of people who are unable to use a traditional controller, there's been little evolution in the design of game controllers. And so for years, gamers with disabilities have had to compensate with different additional devices, oftentimes homegrown devices that allowed them to control a game using alternative methods. In 2016, though, Microsoft reached out to Mark with an idea that had emerged out of an internal hackathon. They wanted to create a video game controller from scratch for people specifically with limited mobility. So throughout the process, Microsoft collaborated with Able Gamers. They got real people with disabilities who were gamers involved throughout the design process. And those people were able to really weigh in on early critiques and product sketches, as well as test out prototypes throughout the development process. While the adaptive controller is a huge win for gamers with disabilities, it's obviously not the perfect solution for everyone. And so Mark and Able Gamers as an organization continue to advocate for further accessibility improvements to both the hardware and software of video games. But what it has done is it's helped show people and organizations what's possible when you take a more inclusive design approach. Able Gamers is now working with multiple game studios, and according to Mark, the things that these studios are asking for are really going beyond what legal regulations like the Accessibility Act require. They're finally looking to make games not only compliant, but also enjoyable by people with disabilities. The adaptive controller is just one example of inclusive design. And this is an approach that takes underrepresented or marginalized communities and keeps them really central in the strategy and design process to create products that are both more accessible, but also more equitable and innovative. This is really the crux of what we're going to talk about today. We're not looking to add on or fix things after the fact. What we're really trying to do is keep a diversity of voices at each stage in the design process, proactively looking for opportunities to bring new voices to the table so that we can identify and address specific needs that have been overlooked in the past. So I just want to pause here for a moment, and if you would like to just type into the chat, I'm curious if any of you have ever talked about inclusive design previously with your product teams, or if it's something that you've maybe talked about in a previous conference or previous discussion. I'll wait a minute to see if anyone has a response. Yeah, so I think some UX events, Dave, you've mentioned here, I've definitely started to see the conversation pop up a little bit more at different conferences that I've attended.
You know, one thing I have also seen, and I don't know if anyone else has seen, Chelsie, is even I'm seeing more even on like imagery and other things, at least the mention and using more built in to help you, because I think some of these things like, especially like teams that are lean, they don't have somebody that's an expert in that to try to build into the tools themselves, whether it's like a Squarespace or any of those types of tools. They might build websites or that to build that in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a great example. Well, let's talk a little bit about why someone might be excluded from the current design of products. So there's a lot of sociological and systemic complexities around why certain people might face marginalization or discrimination. But exclusion is often based on factors like age, education level, gender, language, neurodiversity aspects like Asperger's or autism, physical disabilities, race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic background. So this is a huge list. And many of us have experienced exclusion because of some of the attributes on this list. And if we haven't, we may in the future. Something like age is something that affects all of us. And as the population continues to get older, barriers that potentially weren't an issue for us before could be in the future. Many of us also probably know people who have faced exclusion or barriers to access because of one of the attributes on this list. So why should we care about exclusion, and what does it really matter to us as product people, as strategists, and as product owners and designers? Well, first of all, exclusion can have real life impacts. If you think about the example of crash test dummies, these were introduced in the 1950s based on what researchers at the time considered to be the average male body. This dummy is 5'8" and it weighs 168 pounds. This means that when a woman is involved in a car crash, she is 47% more likely to be seriously injured, 71% more likely to be moderately injured, and 17% more likely to die. It actually wasn't until 2011 that the US started using a crash test dummy with smaller proportions. Similar disparities, though, exist in something like medical research, where women, or particularly women of color, are much less likely to be included in clinical trials for things like drug efficacy and medical devices. If you think about, though, the way that exclusion can also overlook gaps or inequities that we're not aware of because of our own perspective or bias, an organization like Airbnb, they are a group that is very uniquely centered around customer experience and research. So this company was founded by former designers, and so many of Airbnb's early design choices were aimed at facilitating trust between their users. One of the ways that Airbnb sought to build that transparency was to display prospective guests' names and profile photos really prominently on the requests that hosts saw prior to booking. But as it turned out, putting the personal information of a prospective guest front and center made discrimination potentially easier. There was a hashtag Airbnb while Black that began trending, and Cortina Crittenden, the woman who started the hashtag, shared her own story of experiencing multiple booking cancellations until she changed her photo to a generic cityscape and shortened her name to Tina. There were other people that shared similar responses, and it was enough to prompt a 2015 research study that did find that guests with names presumed to be Black were roughly 16% more likely to be rejected from a booking than guests with whiter sounding names. Brian Chelsie and the other Airbnb founders certainly hadn't intended to build inequity into the platform, but Chelsie did acknowledge that the potential for discrimination hadn't even occurred to him or his co-founders prior to the site's launch, a gap that he personally attributed in part to the fact that all three of the founders in the company were white men. But what else is at stake if we think about exclusion? Well, potentially there are real business impacts for our organizations if we don't take the time to consider other people's perspectives in our product development. Just last year, the US Supreme Court affirmed that the inaccessibility of Domino's website and app impedes access to the goods and services of its physical pizza franchise, which are places of public accommodation. This case was originally brought by a blind man who sued the pizza chain after he was unable to order food on Domino's website and mobile app despite using screen reading software. But it's not just accessibility lawsuits that are at stake. The University of Georgia estimates that the combined buying power of minorities in the US is 3.9 trillion. And a 2018 Accenture study found that 70% of millennials are more likely to choose one brand over another if that brand demonstrates inclusion and diversity in its promotions and offers. So do you want to just pause here again? And I'm curious if anyone else has any other stories that they've heard about in the news or any other instances where they've seen potential exclusion in a platform or a product, either something you've maybe experienced personally or something that you've heard about in the news.
Yeah, maybe just even put in just the chat if there's some experiences that you might have had. And I'm sure we all should have at least one of those.
While people are typing, I'll just share a small one that I think is really interesting. In 2012, Google developed an app for uploading videos to YouTube, and they couldn't figure out why 10% of the videos that were being uploaded were actually uploaded upside down. But what they kind of realized after some research and testing was that they had designed the app specifically for people who are right-handed. And so, if you think about holding your phone up in landscape mode, you're probably holding it a certain way depending on what your dominant hand is. And this was an instance where they just hadn't even considered that people that are left-handed would potentially be uploading videos in a slightly different way.
That's a great point. As a lefty, I can appreciate that one.
Absolutely. Great. Well, if anyone does have any examples that they can think of, feel free to put those in the chat. I'd love to hear them. But let's kind of flip over to the positive impact of inclusion. What role do we play as people designing and delivering products and services? I did notice in the chat someone mentioned face recognition AI. That's such an interesting field and such an interesting opportunity to really think about, how we're training the algorithms to recognize faces, what kind of data we're feeding the system. Absolutely, there's a lot of questions. Now, our day-to-day choices as people who are delivering products and services, we can have real impacts on who's potentially included in or excluded from the conversation. So we have the opportunity to build services like Google Home. So for the 20% of Americans who speak a second language in addition to English, there's always been this struggle with using voice recognition software, because if you're bilingual or someone who's bilingual, you know that oftentimes you don't just turn off one language when the other one begins. Usually you're speaking in a mix of phrases in both languages. And that's something that a lot of voice assistants have been unable to process historically. So in 2018, Google Home became the first virtual assistant, to allow users to use 2 languages concurrently without manually switching language. In Google's ongoing user research, they had seen so many requests for multilingual support, and the team felt really strongly that it was their goal to make the assistant as naturally conversational for people as possible. But in addition to creating new opportunities and unlocking creativity, leveraging the unique constraints of what we often call an edge case can actually help our teams innovate by forcing us to rethink biases and assumptions. So one really great example of that is the curb cut, and a lot of people call this the curb cut effect. If you think about the ramps that are built into a lot of sidewalks, those were first introduced in 1971 by a group of disability activists who worked with the city of Berkeley, California, to install these ramps at 15 major intersections. While curb cuts were originally designed to accommodate wheelchairs, we've all benefited from them, whether we're pulling suitcases or pushing strollers. even if you're just a little clumsy like I am and you need a little bit of help getting down to street level. So curb cuts can extend to digital spaces as well. Speech recognition, closed captioning, all of these types of technologies are things that were specifically developed for a what we would maybe consider an edge case traditionally, but they provide benefits far beyond that original use case. So I do just want to pause and take a look at the chat. I saw we got a couple responses just about, yeah, excluding potential users over the age of 60 plus. That's a huge issue. You know, our population is getting older, and digital literacy, even the ability to see certain font sizes, that is, I think, going to become tougher and tougher, particularly as things like healthcare transition more virtual. Who are we potentially leaving behind? I'm curious as well, though, if anyone has heard of any other examples of curb cuts. So any other technologies or products or services that were maybe originally developed for one specific use case, but are really beneficial to all of us. I personally use closed captioning a lot, even though I don't have any hearing impairments. Sometimes, you know, my husband is asleep and I'm maybe up a little bit later than I should be. It's nice to be able to have the audio kind of low, but able to, you know, follow along with the storyline. As I mentioned earlier, I'm also a huge Korean drama fan. And so things like subtitles, you know, obviously being able to switch languages is really useful as well. Audiobooks, that's a great example. Audiobooks can be, I think, beneficial not only if you are, you know, in the middle of doing something or driving, but also certain people just learn better hearing things in an audio format versus reading. Great, well, feel free to keep throwing those in the chat. I want to just transition a little bit now to our teams. How can we start to build an inclusive design muscle within our teams? So there's 3 principles that I want to talk about today. These are adapted from a woman named Kat Holmes. She was a part of the Microsoft design team for a long time. She's since moved on to some other ventures, but she published a really great book called Mismatch that talked specifically about some of these principles. First, our job is to recognize exclusion and think about our role in potentially creating that exclusion. When we design a product or service through the lens of our own biases, we sometimes perpetuate or even create exclusion and inequity. Our work, whether it's digital or whether it's analog, the choices that we make aren't neutral. We're every day prioritizing features, creating product backlogs, recruiting research participants, selecting collaborators. All of these decisions have downstream impacts on who gets to participate in and benefit from our products. The second principle here is learning through diversity. So inclusive design really centers diverse perspectives from the start of the process. That might mean looking for more diverse perspectives to pull into our product teams. If you think about the teams that you work with every day, just reflect a little bit on where are we potentially missing out on perspectives. You know, in the US, only about 19% of people with disabilities are employed. And so I think it's not a stretch to imagine that a lot of our product teams probably have never had someone who uses assistive technology on a regular basis as part of them. If you think about, though, as well, the just uneven distribution potentially of people within our roles who are people of color, who are women in some instances, those are perspectives that we can all benefit from. But it's not just our own teams. There's also a lot of opportunity to collaborate with co-creators throughout the product design process. So bringing in research participants and users as early as possible in the experience, that's obviously something that from a product and a UX perspective, we strive to do all of the time. But how do we think about the diversity of our user research participants? How do we think about what perspectives we're looking to get? And then finally here, solving for one, extending to all. So really that idea of curb cuts. A lot of times in my previous life as a product owner and a product manager, I was often asked to prioritize based on the broadest possible use case. One of the really common things I heard a lot was, what's the 20% of the work that's going to get us 80% of the benefit? But if we kind of flip that model on its head, who are we potentially missing out on? Because we're always trying to sort of shave off the edge cases from our prioritization work. There's a lot of opportunity to use constraints, to use new types of guardrails, to really think outside the box and create something that's more innovative, that challenges our assumptions and biases. And hopefully, like with a curb cut, that solution can also benefit people beyond the original use case. So just checking in the chat, I totally agree. Everyone really does like the bars and railings inside a bathroom stall. Those can be really helpful. Closed captioning, absolutely. British or Australian shows where accents are maybe a little bit stronger. Those can be really helpful. Finally, I see there's a question too, but I'm just going to save that for the end here, because one thing that I wanted to touch on is a little bit about how some of the teams that I work with have been thinking about incorporating this methodology into the work that we do. This is a super short session, only 25 minutes, so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but just to give you an idea of how we're practically incorporating some of this work into our day-to-day. A lot of the work that I do with my clients is around customer journeys. How do we map out what the customer is doing, any potential friction points or pain points that they're experiencing? One of the things I've been really trying to bring more to the forefront of that discussion has been, what are potential barriers that people are facing, and how can we recruit and collaborate with more people who have potentially experienced these things in their day-to-day life? Obviously, this is a really long list, and I don't think that it's practical to try to, cover all of these in one session, but really being specific about where are there instances where cultural differences might change the way that someone interacts with this product? Where are there financial or transportation issues where someone might not be able to access a service? But starting to get really specific about where we're potentially creating these barriers in our products. And then many of you are probably familiar with customer journeys, but one of the additional layers that we've been adding on has been first naming what those barriers are as we collaborate with a diverse group of research participants as we workshop through these journeys. This is an example that I pulled from a project that we did around recruiting, and how can we make the recruiting process as accessible for people as possible. Two of the things that really came out in the discussion were financial constraints. So this client was located downtown and generally required multiple rounds of interviewing. In that case, parking can get really expensive, regardless of who you are. Probably you don't want to be paying multiple times to park downtown, but particularly if you have financial barriers, then that's going to be a huge issue for you. Also, mobility constraints. So navigating downtown traffic, crowds on the street, that can be really difficult in a wheelchair. I'm sure all of you have been in a situation where even just walking on the sidewalk, you're kind of shoulder to shoulder with people. And unfortunately, people aren't really aware of their surroundings or when someone might need a little bit of extra space. Now, in collaboration then with some of the people that we were workshopping this with, we came up with some opportunities for future inclusion. And one of that was just kind of a really easy offering parking validation when people are coming in for an interview. Also potentially considering an optional video call for some of those initial interviews to cut down on the amount of times that people need to come in. But also offering something like an alternative location. If someone has some mobility limitations, then a setting that's a little bit more familiar to them might be more comfortable. How can we offer those options to people who might be more comfortable? But obviously, that's something that everyone can benefit from. If you are someone who has limited availability, maybe because the current job that you're working, at least pre-pandemic, is a little bit further from the interview site, or if you have some transportation limitations, then being able to have more control over where an interview takes place could potentially help make that experience more accessible for you. I think one of the really key things that I don't want to lose in this example is that the best ideas come from the people who have lived those experiences. And so as much as we can empathize with and study and try to understand the barriers that people face, I think the more valuable insights are going to come from people who have actually had those experiences. So we have 5 minutes left. Just to finish off, I want to leave you with kind of a reassurance that inclusive design is a journey. When you start to think about being more inclusive in your research and product processes, it can start to feel overwhelming. There's so many opportunities for inclusion. There's so many aspects of diversity. How do you, start to take all of this on as a product team? We really like to think about inclusion as different levels. So level 1 is access, and that's just the baseline. Is my product usable by a diverse spectrum of people? That should be the entry point for everyone, whether that means digital accessibility or if it means accessibility from a transportation, socioeconomic aspect. Those are all kind of the baseline opportunities that you have to help improve your products and services. Then you move into inclusion. So has my product been designed by a diverse group of collaborators to meet a diverse spectrum of needs? Now you're going above to incorporating more inclusion into the process itself and really involving those people and coming up with a solution that not only allows access, but really proactively meets people's needs. And then the final level here, equity. So does my product anticipate and address systemic inequity faced by underrepresented communities? Obviously, that is a huge goal. I think it's an important one, but it's also not something that you're going to get to overnight. And so how can we as product people start to make those small steps into being more inclusive with our processes, with our research, to get us just a little bit further than we were before? So in conclusion then, if you do take anything away from this presentation, I really hope it's this. The core idea here is that all of us have a responsibility to shape a future that is accessible, inclusive, and hopefully eventually more equitable. When our products or services fail to meet someone's needs, we can't look at them and say, you should have fit in this bus better. We have to look at ourselves and ask, why did I design the bus like this? Great, well, we have 2 minutes left. I do want to check out these Q&A questions. The first one here is, can you speak to the challenge of funding the additional accessibility functionality, which can be significant? That's such a great question. I think one aspect of this is to really build that business case for potential compliance issues, lawsuits, but also more proactive, what markets are you potentially missing out on because of a lack of access or even a lack of inclusion? But also, as with anything in kind of implementation and design process, the more that you can build into the process from the beginning, the less expensive it is to remediate later on. And so while there might be some initial investment to really get those processes off the ground, I would really challenge your organization and your teams to think about how we make the case for things like DevOps, for things like automated and integrated testing. And I think accessibility can be handled in kind of a similar way. I would definitely be curious, though. I am not a development expert. I'm not necessarily a digital accessibility expert. And so if anyone has any experiences pitching these ideas to their organization and getting buy-in from a little bit more of an accessibility lens, I'd be very curious to hear about that in the chat. One of the other Q&As, do you have any recommendations for books, podcasts, et cetera, on inclusive design? Absolutely. I would really recommend the book that I mentioned earlier, Kat Holmes. Like I said, she used to be with Microsoft and really started their inclusive design practice. There's also a book called Mismatch, which I think is a really interesting introduction. Missing Women, which is an interesting introduction to how women have potentially been left out of data sets. And then there's a couple organizations that I follow that I think are doing really interesting things. Adobe has a very robust inclusive design practice head by Matt May. So that's really interesting. He's a great follow on LinkedIn. There's also Google recently put out a book. I have it really close. Google recently wrote a book that also, I think, speaking of the previous question, touches a little bit on making the business case within your org for inclusive design practices as well. I can't remember the title of it, but it's by the Google Design Group, and it's really clearly branded Google. So I think if you did a search for it online, you'd probably be able to find it really easily.
I think this might be just designing for global accessibility, part 1. Is that what it is?
Oh, I think it's something slightly different. It might be designing for everyone.
We'll try to find that and put in the chat, but really great discussion here today, and hopefully it gets people to think and see how they can use accessibility better. We did put your LinkedIn, but do you want to pull up your contact slide again, just to, if people wanted to get a hold of you?
Yes, definitely. Great. Yes, please do reach out. I'd love to talk more about this. I know we have pretty limited time here, so feel free to reach out. Oh, perfect. Yes, building for everyone. That's exactly it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Chelsie. It was great to have you here. It's great to have everyone participate in the chat, and hope you and Chelsie can connect afterwards, because it's beyond this. So thank you, Chelsie.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.